I told you not to sign that. Don't tell me what I can do. This is everything. Ours, not just yours.
You are a disgrace to our name. How dare you accuse me? You did this, not me. We were a family. Look at what you've done. You drove us apart.
Once upon a time, in the big noisy city of Lagos, two brothers begin to fight. Their billionaire father are dead, leaving behind a greatest house, good cars, businesses. Don't forget to subscribe on Tales by Good 10. Share this video. Relax, sit back, and we start our journey.
The sun was beginning to set over the busy and noisy city of Lagos, casting long and golden shadows over the tall palm trees that stood like guards around the massive mansion owned by the late billionaire. Inside the house, the air felt very heavy and still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath because the great man who built them was no longer there to fill the rooms with his loud laughter and strong voice. This house was a place of great beauty with floors made of shining white marble that looked like frozen water and golden chandeliers that hung from the high ceilings like sparkling stars, but right now it did not feel like a happy home at all. In the center of the grand living room stood Bamidele, the first son who was 30 years old and felt the weight of being the oldest child pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy stone. He wore a very expensive watch that ticked quietly on his wrist, and he paced back and forth on the soft rugs, his face looking very stern and his eyes scanning the room as if he were already counting every single thing that belonged to him. Bamidele believed that because he had walked on this earth for 3 more years than his brother, every car in the garage and every brick in their father's office buildings should belong to him alone. He looked out of the wide glass windows at the Lagos traffic far away, thinking about how he would run the family business with an iron hand, and he felt a surge of pride that made him stand a little bit taller. However, this pride was quickly interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the marble floor, a sound that made Bamidele's jaw tighten because he knew exactly who was entering the room to challenge him. Chidi, the second son, who was 27 years old, walked into the room with a look on his face that showed he was not ready to follow anyone's orders, especially not his older brothers. Chidi was wearing a modern suit that looked very sharp and stylish, and he carried a tablet in his hand that was filled with numbers and graphs because he believed that being smart with technology was more important than just being the firstborn. He did not look at the beautiful paintings on the walls or the expensive statues in the corners. Instead, he looked straight at Bamidele with eyes that were full of fire and a heart that was tired of being told to wait his turn. Chidi felt that his father's wealth was like a giant pie, and he was worried that Bamidele was going to eat the whole thing without leaving even a small crumb for him to enjoy. He stepped into the middle of the room and cleared his throat loudly, making sure Bamidele knew he was there and that he was ready to speak his mind about the things their father had left behind. The two brothers stood there in the middle of the most expensive house in Lagos, two men who had shared the same toys and the same bed when they were little boys, but now they looked at each other like two soldiers on a battlefield. Bamidele turned around slowly and pointed a finger at the large portrait of their father that hung above the fireplace, his voice deep and shaking with a bit of anger as he told Chidi that as the first son, he was the new king of the house. He said that in their culture and in the way of the world, the oldest person gets to decide how the money is spent and how the houses are managed. And he told Chidi to go back to his room and stop worrying about things that were too big for him to handle. This made Chidi laugh a very dry and unhappy laugh, and he stepped closer to his brother until they were almost touching chests, telling Bamidele that the world had changed and that being older did not mean being wiser. Chidi shouted that he was the one who went to the best schools and understood how to make the billionaire's money grow even larger. while Bamidele only knew how to spend it on fancy clothes and fast cars that roared through the streets of Lagos. The argument began to grow louder and louder, their voices bouncing off the expensive walls and breaking the silence of the grieving house as they began to quarrel about who should own the fleet of black SUVs and who should control the bank accounts that held more money than a person could count in a lifetime. As they argued, they did not notice that the shadows in the room were getting longer and that the house felt colder, even though the Lagos weather outside was very hot and humid. They forgot about the sadness of losing their father and instead focused only on the greed that was bubbling up inside them like a pot of soup boiling over on a stove. Bamidele grabbed a small golden statue from a side table and held it up, saying that even the smallest decoration in this house belonged to him by right of birth, and Chidi reached out to snatch it away, saying that nothing belonged to anyone until the lawyers finished their work. They were so busy shouting and pointing fingers that they did not see their mother, Amina, standing in the doorway with a look of pure heartbreak on her face. She was 50 years old and had spent her entire life building a family based on love, but now she saw her two sons acting like strangers who did not care about the blood that connected them. The brothers continued to yell, their words becoming sharp like knives, cutting through the peace of the evening and making the beautiful mansion feel like a place of war instead of a place of rest. Amina stood in the wide doorway for a very long time, her eyes moving from Bamidele to Chidi as their loud voices continued to fill the grand living room of the Lagos mansion. Her heart felt as though it were being squeezed by a heavy hand because she could not believe that the two boys she had carried in her womb and fed with her own milk could look at each other with so much anger and hatred over things that could easily wash away with the rain. She adjusted the blue wrapper around her waist and walked slowly into the room, her footsteps making no sound at all on the thick rugs that her late husband had bought from a faraway country across the ocean. When she reached the middle of the room, she did not shout or scream at them. Instead, she simply placed her hands on her hips and looked at them with a face that was heavy with 50 years of wisdom and a sadness that was deeper than the sea. She called out their names in a voice that was soft but very firm, telling them to stop their shouting at once because the ground beneath their feet was still mourning the great man who had laid them there. Bamidele stopped mid-sentence with his finger still pointed in the air, and Chidi slowly lowered his tablet to his side, both of them turning to look at their mother as the sudden silence in the room became so loud that they could hear the faraway honking of cars on the third mainland bridge. Amina walked over to the long dining table that was made of dark heavy wood and sat down in the large chair at the head of the table where her husband used to sit during family meetings. She looked at her two sons and gestured with her hand for them to come closer and sit down beside her, but the two brothers walked over very slowly and sat as far apart from each other as the long table would allow. Amina looked at Bamidele, who was 30 years old, and reminded her so much of his father when he was a young man starting his business in the crowded markets of Lagos. And then she looked at Chidi, who was 27 years old and had the same sharp eyes that always wanted to learn everything about the world. She took a deep breath and told them that it was a very shameful thing for brothers to quarrel over money and houses when their father's body was barely cold in the earth. She reminded them that before their father became a billionaire with big offices and expensive cars, they were all living in a tiny one-room apartment in a very noisy part of Lagos, where they had to share everything they owned. She reminded Bamidele of how he used to carry Chidi on his back when Chidi was a little baby who could not walk. and how Chidi would always cry whenever Bamidele went to school because he could not bear to be away from his big brother for even a single hour. The room remained very quiet as Amina continued to speak, her voice trembling slightly as she told them that the true wealth their father left behind was not the money in the banks or the tall buildings in Victoria Island. She told them that their father's greatest achievement was giving them a good name and ensuring that they had each other to lean on when the world became too difficult to handle. She looked straight into Bamidele's eyes and told him that being the first son did not mean he should be a master over his brother, but rather it meant he should be a shield that protects his younger brother from harm. Then she turned her eyes to Chidi and told him that being younger and smart with books did not mean he should look down on his older brother, because a house that is divided against itself will surely fall down when the heavy Lagos storms begin to blow. She begged them to look at each other not as enemies who wanted to steal a treasure, but as the only two people in the whole world who shared the same blood and the same history. She stretched out her hands across the smooth wood of the table, asking them to hold her hands and promise her that they would stop this foolish behavior before it destroyed everything their family had worked so hard to build. Bamidele looked down at the table, his face still looking very stiff because his pride was still talking loudly inside his head, telling him that he must not look weak in front of his younger brother. Chidi also looked away towards the window, tapping his fingers against his knee because he felt that his mother was only taking Bamidele's side just because Bamidele was the firstborn child. The words that Amina spoke were very beautiful and full of love, but the anger inside the two young men was like a fire that had been burning for too many years to be put out by just a few gentle words. They sat there in the fading light of the evening, nodding their heads just to make their mother feel better. But inside their minds, they were already thinking about the next day when they would go out into the city to see the lawyers. Amina saw the stubbornness in their eyes and sighed a very long, tired sigh, knowing that her words had only touched the surface of their hearts and that the real battle between her sons was just beginning to take shape in the big city of Lagos. The very next morning, the bright and hot Lagos sun rose over the city, but it did not bring any warmth into the grand mansion where the two brothers continued to live like total strangers, sharing the same roof. The large house was completely quiet as Bamidele and Chidi avoided looking at each other while they got dressed in their separate rooms, each man preparing himself for a long day of trying to claim their late father's vast business empire. Bamidele dressed himself in a very traditional and heavy white fabric that made him look like a powerful leader, while Chidi chose a modern, sharp grey suit that made him look like a clever businessman who belonged in a high-rise building in the middle of London or New York. Without saying a single word to their mother or to each other, they walked out of the house and got into two different black SUVs, the heavy metal gates of the mansion swinging open as the cars rolled out onto the busy, potholed roads of Lagos. The city was alive with its usual crazy energy, with yellow buses called Danfoss zooming past and street sellers shouting out to drivers. But inside the air-conditioned cars, both brothers could only think about how they were going to defeat each other at the main office building. They arrived at the tall glass tower in Victoria Island at the exact same time, their cars pulling up to the entrance like two enemy ships coming to a stop in a harbor, and when they stepped out, the workers at the office immediately stopped talking because they could feel the heavy tension blowing through the air like a cold wind. Bamidele walked through the glass doors first with his head held very high, stepping into the grand lobby and acting as if he already owned every single desk, computer, and chair in the entire multi-story building. He marched straight up to the top floor where his father's massive office was located, intending to sit in the big leather chair and assume total control of the family's shipping and real estate companies because he firmly believed that the oldest son must always lead. However, before he could even turn the golden handle of the door, Chidi stepped out of the elevator with a crowd of lawyers and accountants walking right behind him, all of them carrying thick folders filled with financial papers and legal documents. Chidi looked at his older brother with a very cold smile and told him that a modern billionaire's company could not be run by someone just because he was born first, especially since Bamidele did not know how to read the complicated balance sheets or manage the international bank accounts, telling Chidi that he was being completely disrespectful to his elders and to the traditions of their people. For the next several hours, the beautiful top floor office became a battleground where the two brothers quarreled without stopping, their loud arguments echoing through the glass walls and making the managers outside feel very nervous about the future of their jobs. Bamidele argued that he had spent years traveling with their father to meet important kings and politicians across Nigeria, meaning that he was the true face of the family name and the only one the old business partners would ever trust. Chidi loudly countered this by pointing at his computer screen, showing that under his own careful supervision over the last 2 years, the family's digital investments had doubled in value, while Bamidele's projects had lost a lot of money due to poor planning. They exchanged sharp, biting words that were intended to hurt each other deeply, completely forgetting the sweet words of peace their mother had spoken to them at the dining table just the night before. The lawyers tried to intervene and read from the legal papers, but the brothers were too busy shouting and pointing fingers to listen to any reason, their childhood brotherhood completely melting away under the heavy heat of their mutual greed and pride. By the time the evening came and the bright lights of Lagos began to twinkle across the ocean water, the two brothers were completely exhausted from fighting, but neither one of them was ready to give up even an inch of ground to the other. They left the office building separately just as they had arrived, driving back to the big mansion through the heavy Lagos traffic with dark clouds of anger hanging over their heads. When they returned to the Golden House, the silence between them was deeper and more dangerous than it had ever been before. A cold wall of ice that seemed to freeze the entire living room whenever they walked past each other. They did not sit together for dinner, and they did not go to check on their mother Amina, who was sitting quietly in her dark bedroom with a heavy heart, listening to the quiet footsteps of her sons walking up the stairs to their separate rooms. The rivalry had now grown so cold and deep that the brothers stopped speaking completely, communicating only through angry glances and silent doors that slammed shut, while the great wealth of their father sat between them like a prize that was slowly tearing their family apart into tiny pieces. The cold silence inside the grand Lagos mansion continued for 2 whole weeks, until one very hot and humid afternoon, when the fragile wall the brothers had built between each other completely shattered into pieces. Bamidele was sitting in the downstairs study looking over some old property papers when his phone began to ring loudly, and when he answered it, the voice of his father's chief accountant sounded very panicked and shaken. The accountant told Bamidele that a major emergency had just happened at the family's shipping port in Apapa, where a massive cargo ship carrying millions of dollars worth of goods had been seized by the port authorities due to a serious error in the legal paperwork. The accountant explained that if the problem was not fixed before the sun went down, The family business would face a massive financial penalty that could ruin everything their father had worked for, and the international business partners would cancel their contracts forever. Bamidele's heart began to beat very fast against his chest because he realized that although he had the traditional authority to speak to the port directors, he did not know anything about the complicated international shipping laws required to release the vessel. At that exact same moment, Chidi came rushing down the grand staircase with his laptop in his hand and his face completely pale because he had also received the terrible news via email. But he knew that without Bamidele's personal signature and official presence as the eldest son, the authorities would not even allow him into the high-security meeting room. For the first time in many months, the two brothers looked at each other not with anger or greed, but with absolute fear because they realized that their foolish fighting had made them blind to the real dangers threatening their family's survival. Without saying a single angry word, they ran out of the house together and jumped into one single car, with Bamidele driving fast through the chaotic Lagos traffic, while Chidi sat in the passenger seat, typing furiously on his computer to find a legal loophole. As they navigated the crowded streets, Chidi looked over at his older brother who was sweating from the stress of driving, and he realized that Bamidele's strong and commanding presence was exactly what they needed to face the tough port officials who did not care about young boys with computers. At the same time, Bamidele glanced at Chidi's screen and felt a deep sense of appreciation for his younger brother's brilliant mind, knowing that his own pride would have caused him to fail completely without Chidi's technical knowledge. When they finally arrived at the busy, noisy port office in Apapa, they walked into the boardroom side by side like a unified team, presenting a single front that completely surprised the strict government officials who had heard rumors that the billionaire's sons were divided. Inside the tense meeting room, the two brothers worked together in perfect harmony for 3 long hours, with Bamidele using his authoritative voice and diplomatic skills to calm the angry officials, while Chidi presented the flawless digital documents and legal arguments that proved their father's company had done nothing wrong. By the time the clock struck 6 in the evening, the chief port director smiled and stamped the release papers, allowing the massive cargo ship to sail freely out into the open ocean and saving the family empire from an absolute disaster. As they walked out of the office building into the cool evening breeze, the heavy burden of their long rivalry seemed to lift off their shoulders, and they stood by their car looking at each other with tired but relieved smiles. Bamidele reached out and placed his large hand on Chidi's shoulder, telling his younger brother that he was truly sorry for being so stubborn and that he could never have saved the business alone. Chidi felt a warm tear come to his eye as he shook his brother's hand tightly, admitting that he had been very arrogant and that he finally understood why their father always wanted Bamidele to lead the family name with his strength. However, their relief was short-lived because as they drove back towards the mansion in Victoria Island, Chidi received a frantic phone call from one of the housemaids who was crying very loudly into the receiver. The maid told Chidi that their mother Amina had collapsed on the living room floor from high blood pressure because she had spent the entire day worrying about her sons and the fate of the family. Bamidele pressed his foot hard on the gas pedal, his heart sinking with a terrible guilt as he realized that while they were busy chasing money and corporate power, they were killing the most precious person they had left in the world. They arrived at the mansion in record time and ran through the front doors, finding their mother lying weakly on the sofa with a doctor standing over her holding a stethoscope. Seeing their beautiful 50-year-old mother looking so small and fragile made both young men fall to their knees beside the couch. realizing that all the gold and buildings in Lagos were completely worthless if they did not have their mother's love and a peaceful home to share it in. The warm light of the early morning sun filtered gently through the large glass windows of the grand living room, casting a soft glow over the face of Amina as she lay quietly on the long sofa with a thick, colorful Ankara blanket covering her feet. Bamidele and Chidi had not slept for a single hour during the entire night, choosing instead to sit on the cold marble floor right beside their mother's couch, holding her hands and watching her breathe to make sure she was truly getting better. The doctor had given her some medicine and told the boys that her illness was caused entirely by the heavy stress and sorrow that had been weighing down her heart for the past few months. Looking at their mother's tired face, the two brothers felt a deep and painful shame inside their chests because they knew that their constant arguing over their father's aspect was the real reason she had fallen so ill. Bamidele reached out and gently smoothed the edge of his mother's head wrap, his eyes filling with tears as he looked across the sofa at Chidi and realized that no amount of money or land in the city of Lagos was worth losing the beautiful family that their parents had spent 50 years building. As the birds began to chirp outside in the tall palm trees, Amina slowly opened her eyes and looked down at her two sons, a very weak but incredibly sweet smile spreading across her lips when she saw that they were sitting close together instead of standing on opposite sides of the room. Bamidele immediately leaned forward and squeezed her hand tightly, his voice trembling as he begged her for forgiveness and promised her that he would never let greed or pride come between him and his younger brother ever again. Chidi also leaned in close, resting his head near his mother's shoulder and whispering that he was deeply sorry for his stubborn behavior and that he now understood that a brother is a gift that cannot be bought with all the billions in the world. Amina reached out her arms and pulled both of her grown sons into a very long and warm embrace, her heart swelling with an absolute joy because she could feel that the heavy wall of anger between her boys had finally melted away into pure love. She told them that her body felt completely healed now because the only medicine she ever needed was to see her children living together in peace and harmony, just as their late father had always wanted. Later that afternoon, after their mother had eaten a warm bowl of pepper soup and was resting comfortably in her bedroom, Bamidele and Chidi walked together into their father's grand upstairs study to fix the future of their family business once and for all. They sat down at the large mahogany desk side by side, but this time there was no shouting, no pointing fingers, and no angry words bouncing off the high walls of the room. Bamidele picked up a pen and drew a line right down the middle of a large piece of paper, explaining to Chidi that they were going to divide the responsibilities of the billionaire's empire based on what each brother did best. He suggested that Chidi should become the chief director of all the financial accounts, technology investments, and international shipping because Chidi had a brilliant mind for numbers and modern business strategy. Chidi smiled brightly and shook his brother's hand, agreeing completely and proposing that Bamidele should become the chairman of the entire company, handling the real estate, the government relations, and the public face of the family name because Bamidele possessed the true strength, maturity, and traditional wisdom of a firstborn son. With their new plan finalized, the two brothers walked out onto the wide balcony of the mansion, looking out over the beautiful and bustling city of Lagos as the cool breeze from the ocean blew gently against their faces. They felt a wonderful sense of freedom and happiness that they had not felt since their father passed away, realizing that by joining their different strengths together, they were going to make their father's business even more successful than it had ever been before. When the evening came, the grand golden house was no longer silent or cold. Instead, it was filled with the delicious aroma of Nigerian food and the sound of loud, happy laughter as the family sat down together at the long dining table. Amina sat at the head of the table looking at her two sons as they ate, talked, and made jokes together like the best friends they used to be when they were little boys. The great mansion in Lagos was finally a true home once again, not because of the shining marble floors or the golden chandeliers, but because peace, love, and brotherhood had returned to stay forever.